Welcome back, everyone. We're really excited to kick off our keynote talk. I'm going to turn it over, for introducing our keynote speaker, I'm going to turn it over to the very illustrious assistant professor, Dr. Carolyn Crockett, who's in our Department of Urban Studies and Planning here at MIT. So take it away.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Can we give it up for Catherine, this incredible team that has brought us together? It's an amazing morning already, and I just know that the afternoon is going to be even more exciting, explosive, engaging, not the least of which is because of this keynote conversation and speech that we are setting you up for, a really tremendous convening, a tremendous set of conversations that are really pushing us past very limited notions of what disciplines can do, what the science means, and what that means for how we live right now and way into the future. So it is my distinct honor to be able to introduce to you our keynote speaker. Dr. Dania V. Francis is assistant professor of economics at UMass Boston. Her current research involves using experimental and quasi-experimental methods to identify structural causes of racial and socioeconomic academic achievement gaps. More broadly, Dr. Francis's research interests include examining racial and socioeconomic disparities in education, wealth accumulation, and labor markets. Dr. Francis received her doctorate from Duke and also has degrees from Harvard and Smith. She's a co-author of an influential paper titled The Economics of Reparations in the American Economic Review, which is a tremendous paper. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, please, I recommend that for you. Her research has also been published in Science, Review of Development Economics, and Review of Black Political Economy, among other peer-reviewed journals. She's a board member of the National Economics Association and a National Academies of Education Spencer Foundation Postdoctoral Fellowship Award recipient. It's a nice long name. In 2018, 2019, Dr. Francis has been featured on CNBC, International, and TRT World, and her work has been written about on several major publication outlets. So without further ado, please welcome to this stage Dr. Dania Francis. Thank you so much. Welcome. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I'll take this. Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. Is the mic okay? Okay, perfect. So I do want to say thank you first to the organizers and the sponsors of this symposium. I am absolutely, a little closer? Okay, perfect, thank you. I'm absolutely honored to have been invited to give this address today. The opening session was what? It was deeply engaging, wide-ranging, and anytime a conversation takes a turn towards reparations, I'm encouraged. So that was a treat. I'm especially encouraged by the idea of questioning, right, even underlying profit motives and thinking more about a human rights-oriented agenda, right, for how we handle some of these questions. So that was all wonderful. So the theme of the symposium is a very modern one, looking at the intersection of data, algorithms, and AI in relation to racial disparities in housing. But the organizers of the symposium rightly recognized the importance of historical context when studying racial disparities. That was apparent in the opening session. And they've also invited me to share research that my team and I have been conducting on the history of Black agricultural land ownership in the US and the implications of our work for setting the stage to discuss contemporary racial disparities in housing. I'm an economist by training, as was mentioned, and so I will ultimately and eventually be presenting you with historical data and estimated returns on agricultural land. But before I do that, I want to take off my professional economist hat and put on my amateur family historian hat to tell you a personal history that captures some of the nuance that the data alone do not, that I'm going to discuss today. Okay. Let's see. There we go. So my Grandma Ethel, circled on the slides, is the, first of all, she's 94 years young and lives in Arizona. My children and I live here in Massachusetts, but we get to visit her at least once a year. And for me, that's an amazing privilege in so many ways, not the least of which is I get to hear her stories and recollections, right, from childhood, and I'm old enough to appreciate, right, like the significance of that oral history. And so Grandma was the eldest of 13 children, born to her mother, Frankie, who herself was the eldest of 13 children, born to James and Mary Williams, Grandpa James and Mom Mary. Okay, that's there they are. Sorry, it's a little dark. And so, being the eldest child of an eldest child, she was the same age as some of her youngest uncles, right? And so she kind of was raised with Grandpa Joe and, Grandpa James and Mom Mary as one of theirs. And so here, there we go. We find the family in the 1930 census, and I've highlighted little 2-year-old Grandma Ethel in yellow. And the rest of the family is on the previous census page, and I will bring them up. But I show here that in 1930, we find them in Sunflower County, Mississippi. Okay? That's in Mississippi, in the heart of the Mississippi Delta. And if Sunflower County, Mississippi is at all familiar to you, it could be because this is also where the incomparable Fannie Lou Hamer of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party called home. Right? She lived in Ruleville, which is in the northern part of the county. You can see on the map. While my family was situated somewhere between this triangle that made up Sunflower, Indianola, and Moorhead, so more towards the center, and Indianola was the county seat. Okay. 2 counties over is Montgomery County, where in 1963, Fannie Lou Hamer was unjustly arrested and beaten to within an inch of her life and left with permanent kidney damage. I bring this up to give context to the level of violence and intimidation Black people lived under in this part of the country at that time. The violence that occurred in 1963, when the eyes of the nation were on the South because of the beginnings, that violence occurred in 1963, when the eyes of the nation were on the South because of the beginnings of the Civil Rights Movement. Grandma Ethel grew up in this region in the 1930s and 1940s, when there was less national attention directed toward what happened to Blacks in the South, and racial violence went regularly unchecked and unpunished. If we go back to the 1930 census and zoom in on the page where Grandpa James and Mom Mary are listed, there's 2 important things I want to point out. First, they own their land. You can see in column 7 under home data, it says home rented or owned, and they've got the O for owned, and there's a valuation next to it. And this was important because this means that they were not subject to a lot of the evils of sharecropping, right, at that time. And the second thing I'll point out is that they were literate and educated, right? So these 2 facts represent socioeconomic privilege relative to other Black households in the region at that time. So to fully understand how they came into this ownership of land, I'll take you back to the census record page where we found little Grandma Ethel and point out that the very next record underneath her, representing the next farm over, right, the next household over, was her great-grandfather, Davis Williams, who was the father of Grandpa James. And as you can see, he too owned his land and was literate. Okay. Davis Williams, Grandpa Dave, was born in Alabama in 1863 to parents who were likely enslaved. In 1883, he was living in Russell County, Alabama, which is highlighted on the map, which we know from marriage records. By the 1900 census, however, he and his 5 sons were living and working in a rented farm in Bolivar County, Mississippi, which I just highlighted in blue. Bolivar County was the site of Mound Bayou, a prosperous black settlement founded in 1887, and it's possible he took his sons out there looking for opportunity, right, clear across both Alabama and Mississippi. So family oral history tells us that Grandpa Dave petitioned the government for a land settlement and was successful in his petition. That land was the farm in Sunflower County, Mississippi. By the 1910 census, Davis Williams is registered as owning, mortgage-free, the land in Sunflower County. He was successful at farming and he expanded his land holdings. He was able to invest in education for his sons and help them acquire land and businesses themselves. When he passed away, he willed his land to his eldest son, Grandpa James, and willed $12,500 to his 2 remaining living sons to split, which is a sizable amount at that time. His son, Richard Williams, appears in the 1920 census in Kansas City, Kansas, as a tailor and owner of a tailor shop. So Grandpa James held on to his land until his passing in 1976, even when Ma Mary and the rest of the family had escaped Mississippi to Toledo, Ohio in the 1940s. He and his eldest son stayed for the land. And I'll just take a little aside why they had to escape Mississippi. So in the early 1940s, when their older sons were away serving in World War II, one of Ma Mary and Grandpa James's younger sons, teenagers at the time, was threatened with racial violence. And they sent the 2 youngest boys to Kansas City for their own safety. They also, because she was a pretty young 15-year-old girl who would have been under threat of sexual violence if a white mob came around looking for her uncles, sent my grandma away to Kansas City as well. So when their 2 older sons returned from World War II, the family was able to buy a home in Toledo, Ohio, and send for my grandma and her uncles from Kansas City. So through all that, Grandpa James and his oldest son, J.W., elected to stay with the land, right? He passed away in 1976. J.W. absorbed the land into his own neighboring farm, and when he also passed away in 1990 and all of his children lived in Detroit, they finally sold the land. The land today is a catfish farm and is not Black-owned. But the prosperity of the land and the ability to reap the rewards of that prosperity through ownership instead of predatory sharecropping catapulted the Williams family into socioeconomic successes that reverberated for multiple generations in a way that was atypical for Black families from the Mississippi Delta. The typical Black landowner in the South may have followed a similar path of land acquisition as Grandpa Dave, but many fell prey to land dispossession in ways that my ancestors were somehow lucky enough to avoid or at least delay. At the end of the Civil War, Black families owned almost no land, but demonstrated an almost universal desire to obtain it. African Americans soon acquired acreage at a rapid pace. W.B. Du Bois estimated that Black families owned 3 million acres in 1875, 8 million in 1890, and 12 million by 1900. By 1910, African Americans acquired more than 16 million acres. This, unfortunately, though, was the most land they would ever own in the United States. Black farmers had acquired this land against the backdrop of extreme racial violence, sometimes directed at landowners. Planters conspired together to restrict land sales to African Americans. Because many banks refused to lend to African Americans, they had limited credit resources when the Great Depression hit. Even though the federal government enacted massive spending programs to halt the farm crisis of the Great Depression era, the insistency by Southern Democrats that these programs be administered at the local level effectively blocked Black farmers from receiving relief. In addition to controlling government benefits, white Southern elites found other ways to take Black farmers' land. In one instance, a bank, a crop duster company, and federal officials conspired to force a reverend into debt and out of his land. Another common tactic was for a federal agent to delay a loan, to cause a farmer to plant late, reap a smaller harvest, and end up in debt. All available evidence suggests schemes like these were widespread. My grandma said the only time she ever saw Grandpa Joe cry was during one harvest season when he had a huge yield that was going to get him out of debt, but he was cheated on the crop prices. Somehow he managed to hold on to the land. Black farmers made a direct attack on this system in the 1960s when they worked with civil rights organizers to run election campaigns to integrate USDA county committees. White elites, however, used threats of job loss to repel voters and even resorted to blatant fraud with no consequences. A series of federal studies, along with numerous investigative reports, have found that USDA agents continued to discriminate against Black farmers after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the USDA has never investigated civil rights complaints in a systematic way. Additionally, many landowners have lost their property through forced partition sales. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and so, but my co-author on this project, one of my co-authors on this project, Thomas Mitchell, is a lawyer and is one of the foremost experts in heirs property and partition sales. In fact, he was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship on the strength of that work. And so what I've learned about it, I've learned through sort of osmosis through him and hanging around him enough. But the idea is that a lot of times if someone passes away and doesn't have a will, the land, if we're talking, let's talk about Black agricultural land, the land can become what's called heirs property, where any potential heirs, since there's no will, have sort of equal parts of the land, but it can't be partitioned, right? This is part of laws that were passed and part of a legacy of the Jim Crow South. And it was much more common that Black farmers died without a will, in part because they were intimidated away from and separate from these formal legal processes. And so fast forward to even the 70s, 80s, 90s, you saw how large my family was, 13 children of 13 children, right? If there were not a will that was left, there would be heirs really, right, all over Toledo, Detroit, right, that all had some claim to the land. And so part of what happens with partition sales is that unscrupulous folks who are trying to force a sale of the land will go and locate a relative somewhere not on the land, convince them to force a sale, right? Anyone can force a sale. And then the sale is forced. It's usually bought less than the value of the land, and then those who are actually on the land, running the land, right, like living off the land, are forced off of it. So this was really a predatory process that saw the continued decline in Black land ownership, and part of what my co-author Thomas Mitchell's work has done was to encourage legislatures in states to pass I'll forget the name, the Uniform Partition Act, something like that, which basically is a guard against these types of predatory land snatching to happen. So as a consequence of all these factors that I've discussed, by the end of President Barack Obama's first term, the Census of Agriculture reported that there were fewer than 600 Black-owned commercial farms left in the U.S. So speaking of my team, I've been working with an amazing team of researchers on estimating the value of the Black land loss from 1920 to 1997. This paper is coming out in AEA Papers and Proceedings on May 1st, so I'm giving you an exclusive sneak peek today. But you can see my team. I work with Derek Hamilton, who has been very instrumental in bringing forth policies like baby bonds, and thinking about stratification and racial wealth gaps. Thomas Mitchell, who I already introduced to you, and then Nate Rosenberg and Bryce Stuckey, who have done incredible journalistic work on discrimination in the USDA. Okay. So let me show you what I use. So what do? We use county level data on acreage and land values that are available from the U.S. Census of Agriculture since 1920 in roughly 5-year increments. So these data are digitized and available through the ICPSR data repository. And while state and national Census of Agriculture data date back to 1840, we restrict our analysis to the period for which county level data are available, which is post-1920, and we carry out the analysis through 1997, which is the last Census of Agriculture documented in the 20th century. In addition, substantial changes were made to the Census of Agriculture sampling procedures and adjustment methodology in the 2002 Census of Agriculture and after, making comparisons with earlier censuses difficult and potentially misleading. That's another reason we restricted to, we stop at 1997. We also restrict our analysis to the 17 states where almost all documented Black farmers resided. Okay. And here I'm just showing you an example of some of the sort of PDF files of the Census of Agriculture. Some of the more recent ones are, digitally readable, but some of the older ones you've just kind of got to, go in by hand and look for some things. And so that's the joys of working with historic data. Okay. So the Census of Agriculture records acreage values separately by ethnicity in all relevant sample years, allowing us to estimate the acreage owned by Black farmers. Acreage estimates are categorized as fully owned, partly owned, and operated. So an operator is a person who runs the farm, and they can own, part own, or fully rent the land in their farm. So the land in the farm of a full owner then who owns all of their land on their farm may not represent all that they own, right? So if they rent some of their property out, right, we're undercounting some of what they own. Furthermore, an owner who only rents their land out and does not operate any will not show up in the Census of Agriculture. So the land in the farm of a part owner includes the land they rent, so the rented part must be subtracted out to get the part that's owned, right? So this is all, right, that's some of the fun of working with some of the historical data. So we bear these considerations in mind when we use land in farms of full and part owners. Another consideration is how to treat part ownership. Do we include all of that acreage, right? Do we prorate, or do we say, okay, we'll count 50% of this acreage? And so we take some cues from the 1950, 1954, and 1964 National Census of Agriculture reports, where they document the share of part ownership for partially owned Black acreage as 61%, 59%, and 54% respectively. So for our preferred acreage estimates, we include all fully owned acreage, and then we add in shares of the reported partially owned acreage using a linear extrapolation of the reported shares for between 1950 and 1964. We use 60% for the years prior to 1950, and we use 50% for years after 1960. This is reflecting that the part ownership shares was sort of trending downward over time. We also report, just because that's just our preferred specification, but we also report a range for our final estimates based on counting none of the partially owned acreage or counting 100% of the partially owned acreage. Okay. technicalities. Okay, so all of that to show you. So in this figure, I'm showing you the decline over time in Black-owned acreage. Our county numbers go back to 1920, but from the national data, we can see with the sort of orange dashed line going all the way back to 1910, reaching up to the high of nearly 15 million acres. The blue line at the bottom is if we used no part ownership of acreage. The red line at the top if we used all of it, and then the green line is our preferred specification. Excuse me. Okay. So let's see if I am. That's good. Also, estimates of Black-owned land from other contemporaneous sources, such as state tax records, USDA land surveys, Census of Agriculture coverage measurement studies, and spot checks indicate that the Census of Agriculture may consistently undercount Black-owned acreage by 15% or more. We adjust the Census of Agriculture acreage estimates for a 15% undercount in our analysis. So, oh, this is my attempt. I'm not a data visualization person. So if someone wants to come to us and help us do this better, that would be great. I really appreciate it. Okay, so this is my attempt at showing you some variation across these 17 states over time. So I start out in 1925 with the dark blue dots, and I'm going to show you, over time, the dots will get lighter, and that's showing that time is changing. And you'll see that the size, which is the amount of acreage in a lot of places, is getting smaller. So let's just see if this goes, I think. Here we go, 1950, 1974, shrinking, 1997. Very small dots inside those original dots, right? So lots of land loss, but you can also see that there is variation in the states over time as to how significant that land loss was. Okay. Okay, glad we're done with that. So sorry, that's okay, so a benefit of using the county level data is that land values vary by county, allowing us to create loss estimates that are more fine-grained than using national averages for land values. So after 1945, the Census of Agriculture reports the county average value of land and buildings per acre. Prior to that, it reported 3 separate measurements. So they reported the total value of farms for those that were listed as being operated by Black operators, the total value of land and buildings for those that were listed as being fully owned by Black farmers, and the total value of land and buildings for part owners. So we calculate the average dollar per acre value using those total values and the corresponding acreage data for operators, full owners, and part owners to get measures that are comparable with the post-1995 average acre measure. And so here I'm just going to show you the orange dots represent 1945. Each dot represents a year county observation for the county level data, and a yearly observation for the national data, which is the sort of gray dots that you can't see that well. But you can see there's a lot of variation in land values across counties. 1, 2, these are nominal values, and they are increasing over time. 3, we can see in the prior to 1945 period, there's the 3 different measures, the blue dots, the green dots, and the red dots, and sometimes the green dots are just overlaying red and blue dots that are there. And so since we have these different measures, we have to decide, how to treat it. How are we gonna, what are we gonna do for the land values, right? The dollar value of the land, not just the acreage. Well, how are we gonna treat the land values? And so, what we do, we decide to present a range, right? So for the post-1945 period, we use the consistent orange value for each county, but in the pre-1945 period, we use either the minimum of those 3 values, the maximum of those 3 values, or the mean of the 3 values. Okay, so what do we do? How do we do it? So given our data are available in roughly 5-year increments, however, we'd like to compound land losses yearly. So we calculate land losses as even losses between 2 reported acreage endpoints. For example, if 1,000 acres were lost in a county between 1920 and 1925, we'd attribute 200 lost acres yearly between those 2 endpoints. We do the same thing with land values, calculating yearly changes in the dollar land values as the average between 2 recorded endpoints. So this gives us a county year data set with both yearly changes in acreage, which are typically losses, and yearly nominal land values. So we then multiply the yearly land acreage losses by the yearly land values to get yearly land loss values. Finally, we calculate cumulative loss values over time by compounding the yearly values. We apply returns to these values for both the appreciation of the land and the net income the land would provide. Research studies find very high returns to agricultural land in the United States, over 10% after the Great Depression. Even higher returns have been estimated for the South during periods when the rates of Black land loss were high, particularly in very fertile areas like the Mississippi Delta region. So we compound yearly land loss values from 1920 to 1997 at a rate of return of 6% per year for appreciation of the lost land value, and a return of 5% for the income that the land could provide. So a total of an 11% return. And so while we stop accumulating land losses in 1997, so we don't continue to say the acreage we don't continue to count lost acreage after 1997, we do continue compounding through to 2020. Okay, so results. Our preferred specification, which is using the imputed part ownership share and the corresponding pre-1945 value measures, yields a cumulative value of Black land loss of roughly $326 billion. Depending on the specification, our results yield a low of about $265 billion if none of the part-owned acreage is included and we use the minimum land loss values, to a high of about $359 billion if all part-owned acres are included and the maximum land values are used. Put in context, $326 billion is nearly as much as the market capitalization of Ford Motor Company, Starbucks, and Target combined, which was $327 billion in January of 2022. Yet it is only 3.3% of the estimated $10 trillion racial wealth gap. Thus, while the value of Black agricultural land loss represents a significant source of lost wealth, it's still only part of the story of the overall racial wealth gap. We also consider our estimate of $326 billion in Black land loss to be a conservative one for multiple reasons. First, the Census of Agriculture combines Black-owned acreage with acreage owned by other ethnic minorities, so it's listed as either non-white, sometimes it's listed as Black and other minorities, right, or Black and other. So in the early 20th century, there were very few non-Black farmers that would be included in these measures in our selected states. But over the course of the 20th century, those shares of non-Black farmers increased. Thus, we likely have an overestimate of Black-owned land in the latter part of the century, which would mean an underestimate of the loss, right? Second, if Black families were not intimidated off their land, they may have used their land to invest in more land, right, which had a high return in the 20th century. Our estimates do not model this potential counterfactual. Third, due to data limitations, we start our estimates in 1920 instead of at the peak in 1910. This is a decade of losses that we do not include in the current estimate. Finally, we do not capture all the potential returns to land, including the greater likelihood of landowners to be able to invest in more education for their children, to engage in more political activism, and to have more control of their labor and free time. So to conclude, I stand here today as a PhD economist, certainly because of my hard work and my effort, but also as a product of the privilege of a long line of landowners and homeowners. right? I think it's important. We had this conversation in the first panel to recognize your privilege, right? So I can certainly speak to aspects of my identity that lead me to face barriers and marginalization, but I think it's important also to point to aspects that I understand as bringing in a privilege that has been denied many Black families. And this privilege denied through historic barriers to land acquisition and home ownership. And even when land was acquired, the privilege was denied through a history of state-sanctioned and violent dispossession. So I imagine we're going to hear a lot today about the protective benefits of home and land ownership, and how that affords stability, how it affords the ability to finance education, finance small business ownership, right, catapult yourself even further. And so my hope is that as we continue to examine contemporary patterns of racial disparities in housing, we situate them in this history and remain cognizant of how this history reaches out and lays a hand on current disparities through intergenerational privilege. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Francis.
Oh, that's Grandma Ethel. Sorry. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Thank you so much. We definitely have a few questions in the online forums here, but maybe I'll first ask to the audience. Would the audience like to make a question for Dr. Francis? Yeah.
I guess it was implicit in your, or you did comment a little bit on this, but the biggest reason for migration and loss of the land was because of violence or because of all sorts of factors. Can you go a little further on that?
Yeah, so all sorts of factors, right? So certainly racial violence was persistent, right? Although you're right. So if we look at, for example, the figures on lynching, the numbers for lynching in the South were, highest in, even before the turn of the century, the 1900s. And although it decreased, right, it's still a significant amount, right? And we don't have to just look at lynching. It's not racial violence and intimidation took many forms. And it was enough, for example, to encourage my family to move to Toledo, right, through the sheer suggestion of racial violence and the possibility that that would happen, right? So sometimes, that's the difficulty sometimes looking through data, right? That I can say, okay, if I look at the lynching over the time period, that decreased, but I don't have a lot of data to show me, but what was the level of racial violence still, right? So yes, absolutely, racial violence. It didn't have to be just racial violence though, right? That's why we point out the aspects of the state, the USDA, right? So if a state appraiser comes in and says, right, you only have, you only have 40 hogs and you have 100, right? You're not going to get the loan that you need because it looks like you don't have the value necessary, right? And you're powerless to that type of discrimination happening as well. So, so just to bring it to a close, lots of different reasons. In the paper, I think we try to express that there's a variety of reasons that lead to dispossession, the majority of which we argue are discriminatory in nature or violent in nature.
Thank you. I might go asking a one from online, which I think is really interesting. Somebody asks, what were some reasons for different levels of dispossession in different states over time? So you showed the chart there, which has, it varies, right? And this person is also wondering, like, did some have better or at least less racist policies? Is there any policy that explains that, or what do you think?
Yeah, there were certainly policy differences across states. There was also policy diffusion, right, across a lot of the southern states. So if something seemed to work, right, in terms of dispossessing blacks of their land, we saw some of these laws, right, propagate, and this is, some of the partition laws we can think of as that. But there were also differences, right, and so. One thing that I should note in showing that was that it kind of looked like Texas didn't have a lot of land loss, and also Oklahoma didn't have a lot of land loss. We have to update the estimates there. Again, this is a reason why we say a conservative estimate, because there was a lot of Native American land included in those estimates, which would be included in all of the sort of non-white at that time, that we don't necessarily correct for in the estimate that I presented you today. So in some of those circumstances where it seems like there was not as much land loss, part of that is because of this complication of Native American land at the time.
Okay, great. We got a question back here.
Dr. Francis, thank you so much for an incredible conversation. I did not lie. I told you all this was going to be amazing, so it totally was. And thank you for giving us such a fabulous sneak peek into this paper that's about to be presented to the world. So exciting. I'm just wondering, not to jump the gun too much, but thinking about sort of next steps here, and just reflecting even on your comment about your family's migration to Toledo as well, that sort of migration factor that's also influencing this understanding of wealth transfer in a generational sense. We certainly know that this conversation around sort of affordable housing in general has many critics, particularly in communities that argue against the expansion of affordable housing because of what that means for the lack of equity that people are able to create through that type of housing around the country. So I'm wondering if there is any thought about, or has there been work, probably is, I don't know, work capturing what is the state of the value of Black land or home ownership in the country now, or basically in terms of where people wound up through migration. So the land loss conversation is real and so compelling and so well demonstrated in the study. And just wondering kind of what are the, sort of where did people wind up, and how do we have a sense of what that valuation is overall? And I think there's just a lot to say in terms of just overall conversations around housing and equity in this regard. So thank you so much, and just it's been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that excellent question. So I love that question because, I presented a Southern story, and by no means does, the North, the West, right, are they off the hook, right? And so a lot of the migration stories were, we know, right, were stories of migration into northern slums, northern ghettos, poverty, right? Right, we can think of, Isabel Wilkerson's work, The Warmth of Other Suns. Elora Duranencourt does a really good job. She's an economist now at Princeton, has a paper on the Great Migration and looking at that question, right, of where do people end up, and do they end up in opportunity? And part of the answer is that, right, no, the North was not some, right, wonderful place of opportunity for Blacks who were migrating, but was it a better alternative to racial violence in the South, right? The immediate threat of racial violence in the South. I should also note that, we don't talk about in this paper, and you asked me, sort of looking forward, who benefited once the land was lost, right, by Black farmers. And so, part of that other story is to look at the census of agriculture and the data and see, right, to what extent do we see others in the South benefiting from that, especially if, if I, ran off of my farm with a threat of racial violence, and it was sold for pennies on the dollar to someone who was looking out for that type of opportunity, right? That's a tangible benefit, right? So I think that's an excellent question. There is research, right? People have done research on that. Again, I point you to Alora's work and others. And but I think that there's more to be done, right? There's more to be done in that space. Oh, let me really quickly also say that I think it's Naomi Zodi who has a paper looking specifically at housing policies in New York City that were meant to redress some of the past discrimination in New York City by allowing for Black homeowners to buy their co-ops, right? But there's all these policy loopholes that ended up making it a worse deal, right? For those homeowners, because it restricted their ability to get any equity and resale value out of it, right? So that's the importance of thinking about some of these policies, right? Even when there is a policy for supposed redress, right? Like how is it being carried out, and is it actually benefiting those who it's supposed to benefit?
Amazing. Thank you so much. I think we'll have to close it there, but you did answer one of the questions that was online too, which was exactly that question of who benefited, which I think is super interesting to look into. So please join me in a huge round of applause for Dr. Francis. And I'll just take this moment to say that for those of you joining us in person, we have lunch outside for the next hour. Dr. Francis is sticking around so you can have time to find her and then the other panelists from this morning. And thanks so much for making this a great conversation, and we'll all chat over lunch for the next hour. Thanks.